Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and began to be grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "So, could you not stay awake and watch with me for 1 hour? Stay awake and pray, that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away for the 2nd time and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the 3rd time, saying the same words. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him." At once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you have to do." Then they came and laid hands on him and arrested him. Suddenly, one of those with Jesus put his hand to the sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Now today it's Maundy Thursday, the Thursday of Holy Week, and this year, without our reenactment of Jesus' washing of feet and the celebration of the Last Supper, we can consider more of what happened later in the evening, after the supper and in the Garden of Gethsemane. We explore what of the story may be relevant to ourselves, to our world. We recall this story on Thursday of Holy Week, but by what we call the stripping of the altar, the carrying away of the table linen and all our precious items, our icons of Christ, our aids to prayer, our flags, our banners, not in a gentle, respectful way, but in a rough way, in a rough and clumsy way, as the atmosphere around the table changed that night, the journey to Gethsemane and how Jesus is arrested, and as we intend to watch and wait and pray in a Gethsemane that we've made in the Lady Chapel. It is an uncomfortable part of the service. What started as light and a celebration ends in darkness, and we all leave in silence. What makes this part of the story uncomfortable is not only what we see as happening to Jesus, but all the questions it raises for us. Hindsight is wonderful, of course, because we know the end of the story, and we are tempted, perhaps, to fast forward the scenes to the time when the centurion has stood at the foot of the cross saying, "Truly this was the Son of God," or as Jesus breathes his last and says, "It is finished." Or even be tempted to fast forward to the day of the empty tomb, Easter Day itself. But at the time of Gethsemane, nothing of what would happen to Jesus in less than 24 hours would be known by anyone yet. So if we are to experience anything or encounter anyone, let's place ourselves. In Matthew and Mark's Gospel, the place is simply called Gethsemane, and it is the foot of the Mount of Olives, just outside the walls of Jerusalem. It's only in John's Gospel is it called a garden. So it's a quiet place away from the main hubbub of Jerusalem, but not that far away. Those of you who've been on pilgrimage to the Holy Land will have been to this traditional place of Gethsemane, and it's very much probably still in your memory. And of the olive trees, now olive trees, they can live for 500 to 1,500 years old. So the trees that are there now are very likely to be the grandchildren or even the children of the olive trees that were there in the time of Jesus. Gethsemane is also thought to come from the word which means olive press. And therefore the place where the olives from the Mount of Olives would be brought and would be pressed hard, and the oil would be extracted. And the oil would be used for healing, for the preparation of food, and for bodily health. And so the symbolism of Gethsemane, of where Jesus would be hard pressed, and the links with his life as a healer, as someone who was around food a lot, and someone who would say that the provision for the body is just as important as that of the soul, are very, very clear. What happens to Jesus and the disciples there has also made Gethsemane be known as the place of decision. Now, after the supper and on the way to Gethsemane, there's already been talk about betrayal, denial. There's been lots of talk about desertion. There's been a jostling for position among the disciples. There's been talk about trials and testing and the bringing of swords. And Jesus is not surprised by any of this talk. The vulnerability and the humanity of the disciples in all their misreading of the situation, of the urgency of the situation, and of something that they have to prepare for, is understood and loved. So Jesus goes to Gethsemane with his disciples. Now, we could look up and read the accounts of Jesus in Gethsemane across all the Gospels in our Bibles or on Google. We can make our comparisons and we can study them in great depth if we want to. But I will make a simple note here. What happens in Gethsemane is all about being human, and at the centre is Jesus, distressed, anxious, strained, to the point of sweating blood. And yes, there is a medical condition which brings people out in sweating blood in deeply anxious states, and Jesus may have suffered that here. Gethsemane is also about human trial and temptations, and at the centre is Jesus speaking to his disciples about not being led into trial or temptation. And Gethsemane is also about Jesus as divine, or Jesus coming at last to know what he has been born for. And an angel comes to comfort and strengthen him, or as some say, to give him strength to face what he must, rather than the ability to avoid it. The disciples are asked to watch and to pray. Keep watch out for trouble coming, perhaps, but also to watch themselves. Watch what is happening to you and pray. They had been all over the place in their thinking. At the supper and on the way, there had been disarray, noise, action. Now Jesus wanted them to stop, to wait, to watch, to be still and to pray. Rather than action and activity, watching, waiting and praying is given high value indeed. How hard it is to do in times of trouble. So in prayer, Jesus hands himself over to the Lord in trust during a very hard time. He hands over all control. Death is not inevitable. He does not hand himself over in order to die, but a true and real handing over of himself means that death cannot be ruled out. And this is the beginning of the passion of Jesus. He hands himself over to whoever will deal with him now and whatever they will do to him. And what does he give up and hand over? His health and his well-being, his plans, his dreams, his future. But he hands them over into the loving hands of a heavenly Father who is to be trusted. Now, this often gives people some comfort and some strength in their own times of trial, in their own times of testing, in their own passion, when they have to hand themselves over, when they have to hand themselves over to tests and pains and trials of all kinds, when other people are making decisions on their behalf. Jesus has been there, and this helps. This may speak into what any of us is facing at the moment. And for those who only see defeat and failure and nothing to help them at all or encourage them at all in the passion of Jesus, we can say, though, that there is more going on regarding Jesus' own life work. It is only when he hands himself over, when he can do no more and no more can be done to him, does he say, "It is finished." It is necessary for Jesus to hand himself over, to hand over control, in order for the purpose of his life to be revealed. And the sense of completion gives some people the strength and the hope and the purpose for their own lives. The time in Gethsemane ends with Jesus being arrested. Again, we can read all four accounts of the gospel. We can get a sense that this was a struggle. The swords come out. We imagine shouting. Judas hands Jesus over to the authorities by identifying him with a kiss. The shame now of being associated with Jesus. And apart from those who bind him, Jesus is now completely alone. At times of difficulty, decision, or when a troublesome event occurs, when I find myself in my own Gethsemane, my own place of decision, and my own place of having to hand myself over, what kind of advice or way to act or role model do I trust? Well, I hear the words of Jesus. Watch and pray. And then, after a time, with an encouraged heart, I can hear his words somehow say, "Get up and let us be moving." Peace be with you.